Here I'm going to look at a method of doing an operation. So I'm going to here start to draw. What we see here is that we're talking about vectors. Remember what a vector is. A vector is something that has magnitude and direction. So when we have something like this, we can represent a vector using an arrow. This is the most common way to describe something. So you can say that this is what you might call a velocity vector. We can represent the direction and the magnitude of velocity by drawing this arrow. And in some situations, you have to add and subtract these vectors. Sometimes you want to add different velocities together. Sometimes you want to add different positions together. And so here's a method we'll learn in order to do that. So let's say I wanted to add this vector to, for example, something like this. This is another velocity vector. And here I'll use what I just taught you about symbols. This one is v1. This is the first velocity. And the second one is the second velocity. If we want to add these together, there's a very simple method. This might seem very obvious, but you want to know this. What you can do is simply align. Let's see if I have another tool. So what you can do is simply align these vectors together. We call this the tip to tail method. So if you have this arrow here, we can say that this front part is the tip. And we say this back part is the tail. So when you want to add vectors together, you take the tip of this one and you bring it to the tail of the other one. So what that looks like might be something like this. We take this and we move it here. So now we've connected them, tip to tail. So the tip of this one is touching the tail of this one. And then the combination of both of these will give you your answer. The final vector, if you want to add these together, is the arrow from the beginning of the first one to the end of the second one. This is the arrow that can represent you adding both of these together. So this is what I might call the v1 plus v2. That is this vector. So see how we did that. We take one of them, we line it up with the second, and then when we draw something from the beginning of the first one to the end of the second one, we get the sum. When you're doing problems, this might seem really obvious. But if you're actually trying to solve for numbers, this can actually be quite difficult sometimes. Because if you think about this, it's pretty hard to determine how long this is. If I give you the question, if this is a certain length and this is a certain length, and I ask you to find the length this one, you might have some trouble. So this is where geometry skills really come in. I'm not going to go over them. That's too much math. But if you want to solve these, you really need to think about geometries, looking at triangles, looking at other types of shapes. And using those rules, you'll be able to solve these kinds of problems. I'm going to erase the board in 10 seconds. So if you're trying to take notes, do it quickly. What I'm going to move on to is subtraction. And subtraction is actually, you'll notice, the exact same, or nearly. So doing subtraction is actually the same thing. I want to go over the idea mathematically of what adding a negative number is, because this is my favorite way to think about it. For example, when you do something as simple as 5 minus 3, this is equal to 2. If you know what a negative number is, we can actually rewrite this as 5 plus negative 3, which is also equal to 2. So these are the exact same thing. And this is something we can do with vectors. Instead of subtracting things, we can add the negative of something. And let me show that in action. Let's say that rather than trying to, let me use a different color. Rather than trying to, whoa, that does not show. Pink it is. Let's say instead of adding these vectors, the ones like this before, we're going to subtract them. If we want to do this, what do we want to do? Well, the way I like to do it is to add the negative of the second vector. So rather than subtracting here, we're doing adding the negative of this vector. And this is something you should know. The opposite of a vector, when you put a negative sign in front of a vector, all you do is just flip it. the length of the vector stays the same, but the direction is opposite. So actually, what we're doing here is, I'm going to rewrite this. What we're actually doing is this vector plus the vector going in the opposite direction. And then we can just use the addition rules. What was the addition rule? We used the tip to tail method. We simply line this, simply align this like this, tip to toe, or tip to tail. And then remember to find the final part, we draw it from the beginning of this one to the end right here. This is the sum of both of these vectors. So if we were adding v1 and adding v2, this is v1 plus v2. Or sorry, if we're doing v1 minus v2 here, this is v1 minus v2. So what you actually see is this is v1 minus v2 because this is negative. This is v1 here, positive, and this was v1 and v2.